Lord Jesus, you fasted 40 days and 40 nights for our justification. Give to us discipline in our sanctification. But we're with Jasper, Ridley, Thomas Cranmer, chapter 16, the troubles in Calais, and the case of John Lambert. The Diocese of Canterbury included the marches of Calais, which comprised the town of Calais and a strip of territory, some 25 miles long to a depth of 6 miles from the coast. The deputy of Calais was the aged Viscount Lisle, an illegitimate son of Edward IV, who adhered to the old doctrines. His wife, Honor, was denounced by John Fox as a bitter persecutor of the gospel. Cranmer seems to have been almost on terms of friendship with Lisle. We know of one occasion where Lisle sent him some wine for his cellars, and in the spring 1534, he granted a preaching license at Lisle's request to the warden of the friars observant in Canterbury, at a time when the grant of preaching licenses was subject to careful scrutiny. Shows how far he was prepared to go to please Lisle. When Cranmer first became archbishop, his commissary in Calais was William Peterson. Peterson was an Orthodox official who took measures against heresy, but in the spring of 1534, Cranmer appointed John Butler to succeed Peterson. Butler was an ardent reformer, and he began to complain to Cranmer that the Council of Calais was refusing to administer the oath of supremacy in the Pale and were persecuting reformers there. Lisle discharged a soldier from the garrison on charge of reading heretical books, although the books were in fact those published by the king's authority against papal supremacy. Cranmer and Cromwell succeeded after a great deal of difficulty in forcing Lisle to reinstate the soldier to his post, but Cranmer continued to hear repeated complaints from Butler about the situation in Calais. In 1537, Cranmer's friendly relations with Lisle began to deteriorate. On 2 occasions, Cranmer refused a request from Lisle that he should use his influence in favor of the priests of Calais who had been denounced to the council as papists. He also refused to grant a dispensation to enable a priest whom Lisle favored to hold a benefice while he was under age. In the summer of 1537, he frankly told Lisle's representative in England that he'd heard rumors that Lady Lisle was a little papish. Cranmer was obviously reluctant to enter into an open conflict with Lisle, who was very influential noble and on friendly terms with Cromwell. And by January 1538, he seems to have become somewhat perturbed at Butler's activities in Calais. In the summer of 1538, Lisle's faction struck at Damplip. Damplip had been a chaplain to Fisher, and after Fisher's arrest, he fled to Pole in Rome. But there he became converted to extreme Protestant doctrines. Pole, after vainly trying to dissuade him, gave him, with typical generosity, some money to help him on his way to England. And Damplip, passing through Calais on his way, was persuaded to remain there to help the reformers in Pale. Damplip's activity came into conflict with Dove, the prior of the White Friars of Calais, where Damplip exposed a fraudulent miracle in Dove's priory by which people were thrown 3 hosts covered with drops of blood. Dove thereupon denounced Damplip as a sacramentary for attacking the real presence. In July, Butler sent Damplip to Cranmer at Lambeth with a letter in which he denied the truth of the accusations against Damplip and asked Cranmer to use his influence with Cromwell to obtain a cure in Calais. After seeing Damplip, Cranmer formed the impression that he had very good knowledge and judgment, and sent him to Cromwell with a letter in which he urged Cromwell to write Lisle on Damplip's behalf. But Lisle had informed Cromwell that Damplip had been preaching heresies to the garrison at Calais, and Damplip was summoned before Cranmer and other commissioners on charge of denying real presence. Damplip failed to appear and went into hiding. Fox states that Cranmer connived at Damplip's flight. He writes that Cranmer, who was then yet but a Lutheran, was so favorably impressed with Damplip's treatise on the Eucharist that he stated that Scripture knew no such terms as transubstantiation, and sent word to Damplip that if he appeared before the commissioners, he would be arrested and probably would not escape a cruel death. This story is almost uncertainly true. An illegal act of this kind could win approval of Fox in 1563. It is very unlikely that Cranmer would have been party to it in 1538. Cranmer would never at this time have placed solidarity with a fellow reformer before loyalty to the king. It's much more likely that he was speaking the truth when he wrote to Cromwell, but he greatly regretted that Damplip had failed to appear to confound his accusers, for Cranmer wished to remove Dove from his position as prior, or even to suppress the priory altogether, and he was prepared to urge Cromwell to do this even after Damplip had fled. Cromwell at first decided to follow Cranmer's advice, but eventually Dove was only required to make a recantation in Calais. The project of appointing Damplip as a curate in Calais had, of course, to be abandoned after his flight. In his letter to Cromwell, 15 August 1538, when he informed him about Damplip's flight, Cranmer wrote, as concerning Adam Damplip of Calais, he utterly denieth that he ever taught or said anything, that the very body and blood of Christ was not present in the sacrament of the altar, and confesseth the same to be there really. But he saith that the controversy between him and the prior was because he confuted the opinion of transubstantiation, and therein I think he taught but the truth. These words seem to indicate that Cranmer had ceased to believe in transubstantiation as early as 1538. One of Cranmer's biographers has assumed that in this letter Cranmer was referring only to the fraudulent miracle in Dove's priory, and that when he wrote he confuted the opinion of transubstantiation, he meant that Damplip had exposed the fraud of the 3 hosts. This is by Todd, Archbishop Cranmer, Volume 1, page 176. But it is curious that Cranmer should have used no stronger words than I think he taught, but the truth, if he were referring to Damplip's teaching about the fraudulent miracle. For in 1538, at the height of the campaign against relics and forged miracles, he would almost certainly have written a great deal more on this subject. Moreover, it's not clear from Fox's account that the incident of the three hosts was supposed to be connected with transubstantiation. Fox does, however, state that Damplip preached against transubstantiation and also against real presence in his sermons at Calais. There are other reasons for believing that Cranmer had repudiated transubstantiation in 1538. For he certainly renounced the doctrine before he abandoned his belief in papal presence. In 1551, he wrote in his answer to Smith, "I confess of myself that not long before I wrote the said Catechism in 1548, I was in real error about the real presence, as I was in many years, divers other areas of transubstantiation, sacrifice propitiatory of priests in the Mass, pilgrims, pardons, and many other superstitions and errors that came from Rome." This makes it clear that Cranmer renounced transubstantiation some years at least before he did the same with real presence, and suggests that he abandoned all the doctrines to which he refers in this passage at about the same time. He repudiated the doctrine of private masses by 1538, as we know from his letter to Crumwell about discussions with the Lutherans, German Lutherans, in which he wrote on 23 August, 8 days after he wrote this letter about Damplip, and he attacked the Orthodox doctrine of purgatory 2 years earlier than this. Fox's account of the proceedings against Damplip is too inaccurate on other points to be reliable in this connection, but he confirms that Cranmer had abandoned his belief in transubstantiation by this time, and states that Cranmer was then a Lutheran. Altogether, there's good reason to believe that by August 1538, Cranmer held those Lutheran doctrines on the Eucharist, which he appears to have advocated 10 years later when he translated the Catechism of Justus Jonas, and that he had abandoned transubstantiation while still adhering to the doctrine of real presence. Compared to the real presence, transubstantiation was a subordinate view. The 10 Articles and the Bishop's Book had laid down the doctrine of the Sacrament of the altar in a manner compatible with rejection of transubstantiation. It was only in 1539 that transubstantiation was affirmed in the 6 Articles. Even after 1539, it was the nature of the presence, not the change in the elements, which was the real issue between contending parties. And in the controversy between Cranmer and Gardiner in 1550-51, the issue of transubstantiation was treated as a separate subordinate question to that of real presence. It was therefore possible for Cranmer to say at his trial at Oxford that on the issue of the presence, he still maintained the Papist doctrine at the time of Lambert's trial, 3 months after he wrote his letter of 15 August 1538, and to insist that he had only held 2 different opinions and not 3 during his life question on the presence. It has, however, been argued that Cranmer did not accept the Lutheran position when he abandoned transubstantiation, and that in 1538 he believed in the real presence, not by virtue of transubstantiation or consubstantiation, but by impanation in the sense in which it was accepted by the medieval schoolmen. One of the reasons given in support of this view is Cranmer's attitude toward Atkinson, who was tried before Cranmer and Sampson in June 1538 for heresy concerning the Eucharist. Atkinson recanted and was sentenced to carry his faggot at St. Paul's. Burckhardt and Vice-Chancellor of Saxony, who was in London at the head of the German Lutheran delegation, intervened on his behalf and asked Cranmer to permit Atkinson to carry his faggot at his parish church instead of St. Paul's. Cranmer told Burckhardt that as that error of the sacrament was so greatly spread abroad in this realm, and daily increasing more and more, it was necessary that Atkinson should recant before the largest possible audience at St. Paul's. But he nevertheless suggested to Crumwell that Burckhardt's request might be granted, as the Duke of Saxony had freed a man for whom Fox had interceded. That's Ed Fox. It was probably during this summer that Cranmer dealt with the Yorkshire parson, who had called him an unlearned ostler. He refused to make the parson recant at St. Paul's because he wished to spare him the humiliation of public recantation, and because he thought too many papists would believe the story, which the parson would be repudiating. He was far more reluctant to spare Atkinson from the same humiliation, and gave as his reason that too many people believed the error of the sacrament of the altar. Too many papists was a reason for leniency. Too many sacramentaries was a reason for severity. It was always so with Cranmer, for Murray says that he was far more severe towards Protestants than he was towards papists. The fact that Burckhardt intervened in the case is strong evidence that Atkinson was a Lutheran, and from this it appears in the summer 1538, Cranmer was judicially condemning a man who believed in the Lutheran doctrine of the Eucharist. But we cannot definitely deduce this from Cranmer's rejected consubstantiation at this time. We can be sure that when Cranmer stated that the error of this sacrament was so greatly spread abroad, he was referring not to consubstantiation, which never took root in England, but to the sacramentarian denial of the real presence. We do not know the offense with which Atkinson was charged, but Cranmer probably feared that though Atkinson himself was a Lutheran, the effect of his activities had been to encourage a sacramentarian belief in others. However this may be, we cannot be certain as to the opinions on the Eucharist which Cranmer held in the summer of 1538, apart from the fact that he believed in the real presence and was determined to punish any sacramentary who attacked that doctrine. It was during the summer of 1538 that Cranmer had his first serious encounters with the adherents of the Swiss Zwingli Bullinger, who were later in the reign of Edward VI to put such pressure on him to carry through a more vigorous reformation. Bullinger had dedicated a book to Henry VIII, and he sent Claridge and some other English supporters to England to deliver a copy to the king and to other leading dignitaries. Partridge and his colleagues first visited Cranmer and after giving him a copy of Cranmer's book, asked him to present another copy to the king. But Cranmer, though courteous, was unenthusiastic. He at first refused to present the book to Henry, and suggested that Partridge should ask Cromwell to do this. But after supper, he agreed to present the book in 2 days' time after he had read it himself. Partridge then visited Cromwell and presented him a copy of the book. And Cromwell, who was always ready to find any Protestant allies abroad, went to court that same evening and showed Henry a copy of his book. On hearing this, Cranmer promptly delivered the king's copy to the king without further delay, having, as usual, waited for Cromwell's initiative. Cromwell also promised Partridge that he would write a reply to Bullinger's letter for Partridge to carry when he left England. But when the time came for Partridge's departure, Cranmer was said to have been unable to write to Bullinger because he had left Bullinger's letter at his house in the country. This was not the last occasion on which Cranmer showed his reluctance to respond to Bullinger's advances. The excuse was probably a genuine one. We can hardly believe that it would have prevented Cranmer from writing to Bucer or Melanchthon. In March 1539, the English Zwinglians were informing Bullinger that though Cranmer had promised to write him, he was wholly employed instructing the people and drafting discourses in English to be used by the clergy instead of those in Latin, which were in use. A statement which suggests that Cranmer had already begun to work on some homilies. In the autumn of 1538, the old nobility was struck down when the Marquis of Exeter and other papists were beheaded. Cranmer followed the usual practice of staking a claim to the property of the accused men as soon as they were arrested, on the safe assumption that conviction for treason and forfeiture would follow in due course. On the 14th of November, he wrote to Crumwell to make suit on behalf of the chaplain champion for the benefice held by a papist, being now in the Tower and like to be attainted for treason. The papist was duly executed in January. Sir Edward Neville, who was executed for saying that the king was worse than a beast, had been master of the game in Cranmer's parks. When the king appointed Cromwell to this forfeited office, and also to the post of the High Steward of Cranmer's franchises, which had been held in Neville brother Lord Burgundy, Cranmer showed that strict sense of justice that rarely failed him when the king's interests were involved. He refused to deliver the patents of the two offices to Cromwell until he had taken counsel's opinion as to whether the infant Lord Burgundy and Sir Edward Neville's son had lawfully, just check something, and hinted that Cromwell might grant them some favor if the king agreed. Cranmer was engaged throughout the winter of 1538-39, first at Lambeth, later at Ford, in dealing with cases of treason and sedition by papists, including one involving the circulation of papist books in Oxford colleges. He also took action against a sailor who had spoken in praise of Becket in a private house after Cranmer had presented a play at his house at Ford about King John's struggle against the Pope. He was equally occupied, however, in suppressing the extreme wing of the Reformation. On 1 October, Cromwell appointed a commission consisting of Cranmer and 8 others to deal with the Anabaptists. The Reformers were a majority on the commission, on which such notable extremists as Barnes and Crome, who'd face charges of heresy themselves, sat together with Stokesley and Sampson. There are no records of the sessions of the commission, but in November 1538, 3 Dutch Anabaptists were burned for heresy against the sacrament of the altar, and on 23 December, 2 English artisans were burned. There is little doubt that they were Anabaptists, and like the 3 Dutch Anabaptists, they had been condemned by Cranmer and his colleagues. It is significant that though they doubtless had been guilty of wilder heresies, it was for denying the real presence that the Reformers and the Commission showed the Anabaptists the fire. Cranmer's part in the trial of Lambert has caused more embarrassment to his admirers than anything else in his life. We do not know how Lambert fared after his first appearance before Cranmer and his colleagues in 1536, but in the autumn of 1538 he was at liberty in London and attended a sermon preached by the reformer John Taylor. After the sermon, Lambert argued with Taylor about the real presence, and Taylor, having no time to discuss the matter, advised Lambert to send him his opinions in writing. On receiving Lambert's statement, Taylor showed it to Barnes, who persuaded Taylor to send it to Cranmer. Cranmer thereupon summoned Lambert before him on the charge of heresy. There has been a lively controversy as to Cranmer's action at this hearing. His admirers... It's your mom. Here. Excuse me. As a heretic, and maybe we'll just call that here. Glory be to the Father, the Son,